A low mist often settles over Canadian streets in the early morning, softening the outlines of houses and quiet storefronts. For Americans living or traveling there, this atmosphere can feel unexpectedly serene, a contrast to the busier rhythms back home. The streets, though familiar in layout, move with a different kind of cadence, slower, deliberate, measured. Cars glide rather than speed, conversations in cafes carry a soft warmth, and even the distant sound of footsteps seems tempered. It is in these subtle sensory details that life in Canada first makes its impression, shaping an awareness that something fundamental about everyday experience is different. First impressions often hinge on these gentle contrasts. Americans frequently notice the quiet civility embedded in public spaces. Neighbors nod without haste, shopkeepers offer a polite word without expectation, and even the ambient noise of cities feels subdued. This is not emptiness, but an intentional balance, a social rhythm where individuals are allowed space without being ignored. It creates a sense of emotional ease that Americans, accustomed to louder, more insistent interactions, may not immediately recognize as a defining cultural trait. It is often only later, after leaving, that the depth of this calm becomes clear. Underlying these surface observations are deeper cultural differences. Canada's social fabric prizes restraint, moderation, and mutual consideration, whereas American culture often emphasizes assertiveness and competition. Canadian habits reflect a collective tendency toward compromise and measured expression. This manifests not only in speech but in behavior, social norms, and even the built environment. Public spaces are designed for coexistence, traffic flows prioritize courtesy, and group interactions often proceed with implicit rules that promote harmony over confrontation. The pace of life, though not slow by absolute measure, carries an implicit permission to breathe, to pause, and to engage without urgency. Everyday situations illustrate these differences. Standing in line at a bakery, one might notice the absence of impatience or the need to assert priority. In public transport, people offer seats, make room, and communicate with subtle gestures of acknowledgement. Even in bustling urban areas, a prevailing expectation of respect tempers social friction. These ordinary moments compound over time, embedding a quiet reassurance in those who live within the culture. Many Americans, initially drawn by scenic beauty or the reputation for politeness, gradually recognize that it is these repeated, unspoken practices that create a distinctive emotional environment. This early exposure often reshapes perception. Visitors and new residents find themselves unconsciously adjusting to a slower, more observant rhythm, one that contrasts sharply with American norms. Politeness is assumed, cooperation expected, and disputes resolved without spectacle. Over weeks and months, these patterns subtly recalibrate expectations, so that life elsewhere begins to feel louder, harsher, and more hurried. The shift is so gradual that it often only becomes apparent in retrospect. In many neighborhoods, the impact of these habits is felt in the rhythm of daily life. Streets that might seem ordinary to the untrained eye carry a subtle choreography. Pedestrians cross at measured intervals. Drivers yield almost instinctively, and even children's laughter carries a tone of shared awareness rather than unrestrained energy. Americans often notice that these behaviors, repeated countless times, create a pervasive sense of predictability and safety. It is not a rigid order but an emotional framework that quietly governs interactions, fostering an environment where trust and patience feel natural rather than enforced. Public spaces reveal further contrasts. Parks, libraries, and community centers function as social mediators, offering both engagement and solitude depending on need. In a Canadian park, groups often converse without overwhelming one another, and individuals walking alone are acknowledged with a nod rather than approached. This subtle negotiation of space and attention demonstrates a cultural prioritization of respect and mindfulness. Americans frequently find themselves struck by the difference. In many US cities, social encounters are louder, more performative, or more transactional, whereas in Canada, they tend to be understated, intentional, and unconsciously courteous. Everyday transactions offer additional insights into cultural habits. A cashier in a grocery store may greet each customer with calm attention, neither rushed nor perfunctory. Baristas in coffee shops often pause to ask about a day's plans, not as small talk but as recognition of shared humanity. Even mundane routines, such as mailing a package or renewing a license, unfold with measured efficiency, emphasizing clarity and fairness over speed or assertiveness. Americans accustomed to transactional haste may find this difference notable, if not quietly comforting. These patterns extend beyond social etiquette into the emotional climate of life in Canada. There is a collective acknowledgement of personal space and emotional equilibrium. Disagreements, when they arise, are moderated. Conflict is approached analytically rather than aggressively. People expect one another to uphold civility without constant oversight. For Americans used to more assertive or expressive social norms, this can feel almost cinematic in its subtlety and ambient culture that shapes behavior without overt rules, guiding interactions through shared understanding rather than strict enforcement. Over time, exposure to this environment alters expectations. Americans living in Canada often discover that their own reflexes adjust. They wait patiently in lines, temper their tone in conversation, and navigate public spaces with heightened awareness of others. These habits become internalized, forming a quietly transformative layer in their worldview. The gentleness of Canadian life, once novel, becomes normative, and the absence of this rhythm upon returning to a faster-paced, more confrontational environment can feel startling. The emotional texture of everyday interactions, subtle and pervasive, becomes the most enduring memory, a cultural imprint that is only fully recognized in retrospect, long after leaving Canada. The subtleties of daily life continue to resonate in memory. The calm murmur of a morning street, the muted footsteps on wet pavement, the gentle rhythm of conversation in cafes, these details linger, forming a quiet benchmark against which all other environments are measured. Americans often find themselves recalling these sensory cues with an unexpected longing, not for specific landmarks or iconic scenery, but for the emotional steadiness embedded in routine. It is a nostalgia not for spectacle, but for the soft, persistent reassurance that life can move with both purpose and patience. This lasting impression reflects deeper cultural priorities. Canadian life places a premium on coexistence, empathy, and social responsibility. Individuals internalize norms of respect and restraint, not as rigid codes, but as living practices that shape interactions at every level. The result is a society in which personal freedoms are balanced by attentiveness to others, where progress is pursued without sacrificing the quality of daily experience. Americans returning home often recognize the absence of this equilibrium in more competitive, louder, and faster-paced environments. The contrast is felt in subtle ways: an impatient line, a terse exchange, or the untempered acceleration of urban life can evoke a sense of dissonance, a reminder of what was quietly present in Canadian streets. Typical interactions highlight this transformation. Drivers instinctively yield, strangers exchange nods instead of passing without acknowledgement, and small acts of civility accumulate into a pervasive sense of trust. Parks and community spaces invite both solitude and social engagement, blending personal autonomy with communal care. These ordinary behaviors, repeated countless times, reinforce a collective emotional intelligence that shapes daily life. Americans often discover that this approach to social harmony profoundly affects their own mindset, encouraging patience, observation, and a tempered approach to conflict. The effect extends to the broader emotional landscape. The slower cadence and considerate rhythms of Canadian life cultivate reflection and attentiveness, creating a culture in which stress is mitigated not through avoidance, but through measured interaction. The subtlety of these patterns, imperceptible at first, becomes striking in their absence. Many Americans find that the most persistent element of Canadian life is this quiet emotional infrastructure, a framework that encourages equilibrium, understanding, and a sense of shared humanity. Ultimately, what lingers is not a single sight, sound, or taste, but the immersive experience of living within a culture that values calm, deliberation, and mutual respect. For Americans, this becomes the element most profoundly missed: the soft, enduring rhythm of life in Canada, an environment where ordinary moments are infused with intentional care, and where emotional space is respected as a collective asset. It is a cultural imprint that shapes perception, interaction, and memory long after departure, a gentle reminder that the way a society moves and breathes can define the way its people live and feel. Make sure to subscribe, and the next videos will be more interesting.